Chapter 3 is over the importance of communication as a manager. I think one of the biggest things we hear as far as complaints when it comes to our bosses, our managers, is the lack of communication, not making sure that the employees understand what is needed, what is expected, and things along those lines. So, chapter 3 is a very, very important chapter because effective managers need to be great communicators at all levels. Obviously, communication is key, and communication is not just with your employees, it's also communication with your vendors or your suppliers. It's communication with the owner if you are not the owner. Obviously, communication with your customers is a huge thing, as well as communication with the community. All of these are essential to good management. And when we talk about communication, we're not just talking about oral communication as in speech, we're also talking about written communication, and even your nonverbal communication can play an important role in how you communicate with people. So Exhibit 3.2 looks at the communication process, and you see the person icon on the left, that's going to be the sender, that's the person that's talking. And what they are doing is through that message channel, they send what's considered message content. So the content is the actual information that's being sent. But in addition to the content, it's also the message context that the receiver picks up. So not only the content of what is being delivered, but also the context in which you put it. Depending on how you are communicating, will depend on how content and context becomes interpreted by the receiver. It's amazing how through oral communication, what you say, but also how you say it, the context, can make a huge difference in how the receiver applies it and how they interpret your message to be. Where on the other side, when you are doing written communication, it is, like what they say, black and white. And so people add their own interpretation into it. So that can be another avenue that you need to be considering when you are communicating via written communication, is that you aren't adding context to it. They're adding their own context in a lot of instances. So it's something that you as a communicator, as the sender of that communication, need to be conscientious about when you are sending communication, whether it is written or orally, to make sure that it's not being misinterpreted by the receiver, or at least doing your best effort to make sure that's not being misinterpreted by the receiver. When we talk about communication, there are three basic flows of communication. There's upward communication, lateral communication, and then downward communication. So upward communication is you reporting to those that are above you in the management chain. So this is reports that you would send to managers. These are schedule requests, suggestion box ideas, things that are going up to that next level of management are considered upward communication as far as communication flow. Lateral communication is what you do through personal networking, during team meetings, and communication between department heads. So the chef talking to the front of the house manager, or the front of the house manager talking to the bar manager, things along those lines. Downward communication is things such as the posting of the weekly schedule for your employees, the management decisions that are being made and communicated to your employees as far as that decision that's been made, any updates that you might be giving to your employees, and then any annual reports a lot of times are considered that downward flow as far as communication is concerned. And depending on which way you are communicating, you can have slightly different approaches to how that communication is given, how it goes out to those individuals. The other thing that you take into consideration in Exhibit 3.5 is the message context. How you're sending it out, it makes a huge difference. So you have these inner, middle, outer circle is a great visual for how message context comes into play. So if you are looking at the inner circle, that's that sender receiver environment. So it's me and you talking, just you and I having a conversation, or maybe you, me, and a third person, but it's a very, very small, intimate conversation where you just have a couple of people that are communicating back and forth, whether again orally or written. And a lot of times you can see it can sometimes be a little more casual than you would find at some of the other levels, but it's also a big one where you have that genuine one person's the sender, one person's the receiver, vice versa, going back and forth. With the middle circle message context, that is getting into your department communications, your team communications, your restaurant communications. So those are sending out memos to your staff or having a pre-shift meeting with the kitchen, letting them know about what's going on tonight, any groups coming in, things along those lines. It's having communication with small teams is basically what you're looking at there. Again, whether it's a written form like a memo to your kitchen staff, or whether it's that pre-shift meeting that you might be going over what's going on tonight, who are special guests coming in, any big parties, things along those lines. Then the last level is that outer circle context, and that's when you're communicating with either the entire organization as a whole or even with the public. Maybe you, as the owner, are putting out a memo to the entire restaurant, front, back, house, the whole 9 yards, as far as upcoming holidays and things along those lines. Or maybe there's a big change that's going to be happening that needs to be communicated to the entire organization. Likewise, of course, you also have the public, whether you are sending out press releases or you have your social media that's being taken care of that is seen by your customers, your vendors, suppliers, not just the employees, but the general public is seeing that message, whether again it's being in a written format or it's something that's being done orally because it's a TV segment or something along those lines. Each of those levels of context, again, just like the communication flow, can have slight variances as far as how the communication needs to be sent, or what are some of the best ways to communicate based upon who is the intended receiver of the information. Communication challenges. So there are some things that we need to be conscientious about. We need to think about before we type something to send or we say something to somebody, to make sure that we are making sure the receiver understands what we are trying to communicate. So some things you got to think about is word meaning. Is there multiple meanings for a word, and is it going to be interpreted different than what you intended to? Jargon. We have this tendency to use industry terms a lot, especially with other industry people, and sometimes we forget that not everybody understands the information. I'll give you a personal example. When I'm giving a tour or I'm talking to somebody who's not necessarily industry folk, I'll use the term sous chef, and I'm hoping you all that are listening to this know what that means. But not everybody knows what a sous chef is, and so a lot of times if I use that word, like if I'm giving a tour or something like that, I always make sure I pause and I ask, are you familiar with that term? And if they're not, then I let them know, that's like the assistant manager to the chef. Or there are some instances where jargon you really just want to kind of leave off altogether, because you got to be careful, because sometimes people are not necessarily in an education mode. They don't want to feel like they're being talked down to, or that you're talking over their heads. So be careful about industry jargon that you might be using that people do not understand. So it's something to think about when it comes to communication. Cultural differences, things that we need to be conscientious about. I'll give you an interesting example of a cultural difference. You know, a lot of times, if somebody asks where something is, not only is it usual for us to verbally tell them where it is, but a lot of times we will take our pointer finger and we will point to maybe where we're going. Well, in other cultures, pointing with your pointer finger is considered aggressive and rude. And so I have a story of a friend of mine that actually did her internship at Disney. And she was taught that if they were asking, let's say, directions to the restroom, they could tell them where it would be at, but instead of pointing with their pointer finger, they would actually use two fingers. They'd use their pointer and their middle finger, and instead of doing a direct point to where it is, they would kind of do this kind of circular motion and eventually work their way to where that area is. Because if it's a direct point, again, very aggressive, it can be considered rude. And I thought that was interesting because, again, I'm from the Midwest right here. So if somebody says, where's the restroom? I use my pointer finger and I say, it's right over here to the right, second door on the left-hand side, you know, and we don't think anything of it. But, you know, I didn't realize that, hey, you know, in certain cultures, that's considered a rude gesture. And so we want to be conscientious about that, because the last thing we want to do is do something that we are unintentionally being rude to our customers or our suppliers or things along those lines. So when you are communicating, just be conscientious of cultural differences and what it might be interpreted as by the receiver. Assumptions. We all know the old adage. Wait. Here we go. I'm assuming we all know the old adage of what happens when you assume, right? Should be very careful about making assumptions about what people know, what they don't know, anything along those lines, because by doing that, you either are confusing them, or you're making an assumption on the other side that they don't know it, and it seems like you're talking down to them. So be careful about assumptions about who your target market is that you are communicating with. Fixed ideas. Remember that people have certain ideas that are fixed in their minds, and the fact that we need to be conscientious about that and be able to adapt as we need to. You know, like I talked about in chapter 1, as managers, it should not be everybody adapts to me. It's I adapt to others, you know, and that's a big one when it comes to those fixed ideas. Opinions. Be careful when you're communicating that you are communicating facts, especially if it's a fact-based communication that's going out and not just your opinion. Depending on what the content of the message is, opinions can be a part that go in there nice, but a lot of times, especially in professional communications, it's one of those where you know, just the facts is what you are wanting to communicate with whoever the receiver is. So be conscientious about when you communicate, whether it's written or it's oral, what information needs to be sent out. And is it just the facts that need to be sent out? Is your opinion something that makes sense? Or is it something that's not going to add to the value of that communication or cause miscommunication on the part of the receiver? Distracting workplace. You know, there's a time and place for everything. When you need to communicate with somebody, make sure you are doing it in an environment where the receiver can actually receive the message. If you're trying to talk to somebody about their, let's say, job progress, it doesn't make sense to do it in the middle of a rush on a Friday night, because they're not going to be paying attention. The receiver is not going to be able to process that information because they're in a distracted environment because they're trying to get orders out. So make sure when you are looking at timing when it comes to that, which is the next one, is that you are in a place where it's not a distraction to the receiver for what you're trying to communicate. Again, timing is another thing as well. If it's something that is a constructive criticism or something that's maybe can be construed as negative, timing might not be the best to do it right at the beginning of the shift, because that's going to potentially put them in a sour mood depending on how you're able to communicate. So maybe it's something to talk to them about at the end of the shift, or things like that. What is the best timing to communicate what you're trying to communicate with somebody? If you guys are going to have to shut down for 2 weeks of an issue, Friday night right before dinner shift, probably not the best time to communicate that type of thing. So be thinking about when is the best timing for that communication to happen as well. Clarity, making sure it's understood, making sure your actual communication is clear and that people understand what you are trying to say and that it's not becoming muffled, jumbled, things along those lines. The age of mask wearing and COVID, of course, made that really interesting as far as clarity is concerned. When you're trying to talk through, a mask and you sound like when it comes to communication. But again, we want to make sure we are being very clear and that our receiver is understanding what we are saying, the content that we are trying to send to them. And then, of course, tone makes a huge difference when it comes to oral communication, for sure, because it's amazing how you can say a phrase and depending on how you say it, the tone can make a huge difference. So those are things that you need to be conscientious about when it comes to how you communicate with people, whether again it's through oral communication, written communication. We need to be conscientious about how we communicate with our receivers to make sure it's coming across the way we intend it. So some good basic speaking principles for us. And this is Exhibit 3.7. Make sure we're speaking clearly. Remember, delivering very concise messages: who, what, where, when, why, how. Pronouncing words correctly. When you are speaking, especially, people assume that you are knowledgeable about that topic. And so you want to make sure that you are coming across as the authority figure and the person that's in the know. So it's making sure that when you're pronouncing certain words, it's amazing when you pronounce something incorrectly, how unfortunately you lose credibility with that listener, especially if that listener knows how it's supposed to be communicated, and for some people, that are very adept when it comes to the English language and grammar and stuff, it can be like nails on a chalkboard too. It can even get to that point. So when you're speaking, make sure concise messages: who, what, where, when, why, how, and pronounce your words correctly. Make sure you're using suitable language. Minimize that use of jargon so you don't have to clear up concepts, especially for people that are not in the know. Define any technical terms. Again, don't make an assumption that they know what a technical term that you use means. Do a very, very quick definition of that. Try not to make negative comments as much as possible. Again, negative comments are ones that people just start tuning them out, or it affects their perception of items when you're using a bunch of negative comments and stuff when it comes to the language that you're using. And try to avoid slang as much as possible. It's one thing if you're having a personal conversation, you and somebody else, and there's some slang that's being used, but when you are talking to a group or you're doing a memo to the entire organization or things along those lines, you want to use more formalized language. So you want to try to minimize or avoid the use of slang in that respect. Interacting with listeners. Make sure you are verifying understanding. When I'm listening to, whether it's one of you as a student, or when I'm listening to an employee, or even when in a lot of instances, especially if it's something where there's a an issue that's come up, I always want to make sure that I'm verifying understanding. I a lot of times will repeat back what the speaker has told me, so I'm verifying the understanding that's going on right now, because I want to verify that here's what I got from your message. Is this correct? Right? Try to create a relaxing environment is a big one when you're interacting as well, because it could be an uncomfortable conversation that you got to have. So if you can try to create as relaxing an environment as possible, it can make that communication much easier. And try to maintain eye contact as well when you are communicating, because that lets the person that you're communicating with know that you have their undivided attention. If you are, glancing down at your phone, if you're looking at every place else besides who the speaker is, a lot of times that nonverbal communication there will signal to them that you're really not paying attention to them. It's not important to you. So as a manager, by maintaining your eye contact when you're having communication and conversation with your employees, it's amazing how far that can go to show your employee that, hey, you care about the situation, you want to get this situation um, handled, and that you have a genuine concern about it. Don't forget about nonverbal communication. Make sure your body language does not interfere. You got to make sure you look approachable. When you have that person that has the scowl on their face and they've got their arms across their chest and they don't look approachable, it makes it tough for communication because people don't feel like they can talk to you. Make sure you're using appropriate gestures. And, I know people are different ways. I have some people that like to, what they say, talk with their hands, where their hands are moving all the time. When it comes to that, I know for some people that can be distracting. If you are a person that uses a lot of hand gestures, especially when you are talking, be mindful that can sometimes be distracting to some people. So be conscientious about those. Use reasonable facial expressions. You don't want to look or sound monotone, but also you don't want to look fake as well. So again, remember what your face looks like is telling people how you feel, whether that's how you feel or not. You have people that have that natural grumpy looking disposition, not that they're mad or anything, but they have that grumpy looking disposition. There is slang that people use for that I won't use on here for this lecture, but you've probably heard it before. And it's not that they're actually mad or upset. It's just when they're in a neutral position, that's just the way their facial expressions look. And people assume that they're angry or they're frustrated or what have you, even though they're not. If that's you and you are a manager, be conscientious about that, because you can look unapproachable to your employees, even though you're not meaning to do it. Act like a professional. It's one of those, again, the first part of being a professional is looking at and acting like it. So if you want people to treat you as a culinarian, act like a culinarian. If you want people to treat you as a chef, act like a chef, act like a professional, right? It goes a long way when it comes to people's perception about you, just by acting in that professional manner. Personalizing your message for listeners. Again, we talked about this a little bit ago, but consider cultural differences and what is considered appropriate and inappropriate with different cultures and stuff, depending on who you are communicating with. Try to find ways to overcome language barriers. Think about the listener's age and education. That's an interesting one as well. When I go and I talk to a potential student that's just out of high school, the way I communicate and I give a tour and stuff for the facility is different than if I'm giving a tour for somebody who is a second career student, maybe in their 30s or 40s. I'm not going to be asking them questions about what was your favorite subject in high school, or, what's, things like that are going to be, it's going to be a different conversation. So be conscientious about who your audience is, their age, their education level, or potential education level, and make sure you are adapting as far as how you communicate. And then last but not least here under the principles is varying your speech pattern. Changing the voice tone and pitch is a huge thing. Hopefully you notice that's something that I try to do. I'm not speaking in a monotone voice when I am giving you a lecture. You should be able to hear different tones and different inflections and stuff when it comes to, sorry, I can only do that for so long before it makes me giggle a little bit. But, I know we've all heard that teacher, that professor, or that person that they're going to talk about something and you're like, oh my gosh, just make it stop, because they don't vary their tone or their pitch. And it just becomes almost grating to listen to. And if not, you end up tuning them out. So try to be conscientious when you are speaking to make sure that you are changing the tone and the pitch in your voice, because it helps to keep people engaged as opposed to that monotone. Pausing after important points. Speaking at a steady pace is a couple of other big things when it comes to delivering speeches. First and foremost, especially when you're new to this and you're nervous, the thing you want to do is talk as fast as you can just so you can get it all done, and then we're done with the speech, blah, 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 blah. Thing is by doing that, people are not going to pick up on your speech as well. They're going to miss parts, and it just doesn't seem as put together when you speak fast. And again, I know it's tough for a lot of you, especially if you're not used to doing it, but you need to make that conscious effort to slow down, and not like, today, ladies and gentlemen. That's just crazy. You don't need a slow pace. You want that steady pace. So you're not trying to talk a million miles a minute, but you're also not trying to do sloth-like kind of communication, right? And try to find not only those changes in tone and pitch, but pause for emphasis, and change your voice a little bit, maybe a little bit louder at points you want to emphasize. Those little variations that you do when you speak, it doesn't seem like much, but it can make a huge difference in making sure that you're keeping your audience's attention longer than if you're not doing those things. So good writing principles that you should be thinking about, and then also nonverbal communication. So when we are looking at writing principles, some things that you want to do if you're sitting down to write a speech or write a memo or something along those lines, like we talked about earlier, even with the speaking part, think about who your reader is, okay? Making sure, the age group they are in, their average education level, making sure that you are writing to that level that you're supposed to be. You don't want to make it too simplified, but you don't want it over their heads either. What do you want to accomplish? Write down what you want to happen as a result of the written message. If before you even start writing the memo or whatever, you just jot down real quick, this is your goal. This is what you're trying to accomplish by sending this memo out or whatever it may be. It can sometimes help you focus in on what's important, so you end up not being rambling in your letter or whatever that you might be sending out. Along the other lines, identify the benefits of the message. How does it help the company, the reader, your customers, the employees, and how does it help you? You can go back to chapter 2 and how does it affect the mission statement and the vision statements and our value statements that we've created for our establishment? Because you can then apply those to your written process, that can help as well, because then you can look at it and say, oh, okay, this thing is helping our mission statement because of this, and here's the goals that we're trying to reach, whatever that case may be. Even if you don't put that in there specifically, if that's part of your in the background when you're writing, that can be a benefit to you. Think about the situation. Of course, the 5 W's and how questions, who, what, where, when, why, and how. All those things are great starting points for you as far as how we put together this written communication. Of course, identify what topics and group them in details underneath them as far as how you want to, what you want to communicate. Make sure you order the topics in a logical flow. So it makes sense you're going from one topic to the next if you're doing multiple topics in this communication. Write the body of the message first, then the introduction, then the conclusion. For some of you, you might be going, man, this sounds familiar. This just sounds like English class, doesn't it? That was the exact same thing that your English professors or your English teachers in high school probably talked to you about when it came to writing papers. Write the body of it first, then the introduction, and then the conclusion for it. Read the draft of your message, edit and revise the content and flow to make sure it's easy to read. Of course, check for spelling, grammar errors, and make sure that all of those are good to go. Remember, when you first write it, try not to make that one your final draft. Make that your rough draft, and look back at it, go back at it, and then relook at it. I mean, I try to do that all the time, even with something as simple as an email. Like, I don't not send it right away, but I'll write it and then I'll go back and I'll read it 2 or 3 times more. And there'll be sometimes I notice something, whether it's a grammar error or something where I go, oh, wait a minute, that doesn't actually make as much sense now that I've had time to just read it and I'm not typing with it. So take a minute and reread what you are writing, whether it's through an email or you're putting out a memo or it's a formal document. And depending on the time frame of it, if you need to take a break from it for a little bit and come back and look at it so you have fresh eyes, that's not necessarily a bad thing either. If the document is very important, ask somebody else to read it and make suggestions as necessary. I am fortunate that I have people in my life that are also good at grammar and sentence structure and English and things along those lines. And so I'm always comfortable to say, hey, Mel, will you take a look at this document for me and give me any suggestions? And she'll go in and, oh, well, this sentence doesn't make sense, or is this spelling right? The grammar seems a little weird to me. And then, she gives me suggestions on, things that she would look at to improve. And I know she does the same thing with me as well. But if you have somebody in your life that you feel comfortable with doing that, and especially if it's a really, really important document, take the time to let somebody else look it over to make sure that you're not missing something that you've been looking at so long that you don't even notice it, but they might. Again, that fresh set of eyes can make a huge difference. Then, of course, you get to that point, then you're gonna, finish up that final draft, and then, of course, distribute that message. Depending on how it is, it could be electronic distribution, or it could be something that's actually mailed out, or a combination, whatever the case may be, but that gets distributed. So that's the basic process as far as writing. Again, whether it's an email, whether it's a memo, formal letter, whatever that case may be. Nonverbal communication examples, Exhibit 3.9. So your facial expressions, again, I talked about that just a bit ago, makes a huge difference. Your arms crossed, hands across your arms across your chest, behind your back. Again, those signal some different potential things about you, depending on that in combination maybe with your facial expressions. Your gestures are things that are examples of nonverbal communication. Back and forth pacing. I do it myself. Sometimes when I'm lecturing in person, I will I won't usually stand behind a podium. I have been known to not only a little bit back and forth, but sometimes I'll walk up the aisles and I'll be lecturing from the back of the classroom, talking and things along those lines. Be careful depending on the audience that you have and stuff, that it's not distracting. Obviously, if I'm in an auditorium where there's a bunch of people in there, I'm not going to be walking down the aisles chit-chatting. Well, maybe I might, but I don't think I would be necessarily. Some people are more comfortable with behind that podium and being in one place, and some people like a little bit of movement. Just be careful that the movement is not so much that it distracts from the content that you have. Your posture is another thing. Are you standing up straight? Are you slouched over? Again, trying to give that professional air about you. Your posture makes a difference. Touching, that one you got, of course, to be careful when it comes to that. You're not necessarily, like you're doing an inverbal, like if you are sympathizing with somebody, somebody just had death in the family, it's not necessarily unheard of for you to put your hand on somebody's shoulder and, oh, I'm so sorry to hear about the passing of your aunt, or whatever that case may be. Those are some things, that comes from that nonverbal side as far as a communication of sympathy that comes along with that. Invasion of personal space. Again, be careful that you're not, making people uncomfortable because you are inside their personal space. That's especially true when you're having individual communication with people. You can have a close conversation with somebody, but when you feel like you're so close that, oh my gosh, I can tell what you had for breakfast this morning, that can make people feel uncomfortable. You're invading their personal space, which then changes how they perceive your communication. So be careful that you're maintaining that personal space with people when you are having conversations with them. Again, your clothing and appearance, whether you like it or not, we judge people based upon their looks. If you are doing a professional presentation and you come in an old t-shirt and ripped jeans, people are not going to take you as serious than if you were coming in, like in my case, in chef whites or in a coat and tie or something along those lines. What you're wearing to coincide with the presentation you might be giving makes a huge deal. Your appearance as well. Do you look like you just rolled out of bed and you got your hair all messed up and not looking put together? And that can make a difference in the perception of the receivers of your information. And I had mentioned earlier, but eye contact is another one. Interesting story. When I think it was my senior year in high school, we had this history teacher that would never make eye contact with us. Like when he was lecturing, you could tell he was looking at the wall behind us, and it was just really strange. And I remember more than a few of us in class mentioning that he never looks at us, he's always looking at the back wall. It just was always strange. It was a distraction for us because it's like he was on purpose not looking at us. And for him, it might have been that it was easier for him to lecture without looking at people and seeing the bored looks on our faces. Not that I was like that at all or anything, but my other classmates and stuff. I don't know what the reasoning was, but it was always strange that he never made eye contact with any of the students when he was doing his lecture. It was like he was looking right above our heads at the back wall. Now, by making eye contact when you are communicating, and again, that's not just like I just gave the example. That was to a room of 20 students or so. So when you are giving a lecture or you're talking about something to a group of people, yes, you're not going to necessarily make eye contact with every single person, but try to make sure you are making eye contact with your audience. If you are having a one-on-one communication with somebody, most definitely make sure you have eye contact with them. Again, like I said earlier, it is showing that you are engaged in that conversation. You're listening to what they have to say. You're not distracted by other things. So that eye contact makes a huge difference, whether it's a one-on-one communication or you are talking to a group of people as well. Another thing with communication is don't forget how your actions and words may be perceived by your employees and by the public. Remember, no matter what you say, actions can speak louder than words. Okay? The other thing to remember are words are more powerful than we think, so be careful how we use them. because, words are pretty darn powerful. They have the power to uplift and to make people smile and laugh and bring joy, but they also have the power to hurt. Depending on how we use them, we can use them to cut people down, to hurt them, not physically necessarily, but emotionally. And when you are a manager in that position, when you are talking to your employees, remember what you say and how you say it can make a huge difference to that employee. So be conscientious about the words you're using, and remember that no matter what you are saying, your actions can speak louder than those words. Make sure you are doing what you're saying when it comes to a lot of that stuff. Try to lead by example as that manager, as that leader. One of the toughest things to do is constructive feedback. It's a nice word for that, constructive criticism. Criticism has a negative connotation. Using constructive feedback, again, it's kind of interesting how, again, words make a huge difference. You're going to have to, as a chef, as a manager, give your employees constructive feedback, because there are going to be times where it's not going to turn out perfect. You're going to need to, give them that feedback on how they can improve. And so here are some pretty good guidelines on how you can give some feedback. So first and foremost, do not judge too quickly on something. Before you communicate, before you react, make sure you have all the facts at hand and not just one side of the story. Make sure you have all sides of the story before you go about communicating. Keep an open mind. Remember, when you are making a decision as a manager, that decision is based upon facts, not your emotions. Right? And for some of us, or maybe a lot of us even, it's really easy for us to have that knee-jerk reaction. So we have a communication that we don't like from somebody, and our immediate reaction is that knee-jerk reaction is to just fire back. And that's not necessarily the best thing we want to do. We don't want to communicate on our emotions. We want to communicate on the facts that we have gathered. So as a manager, as a chef, we want to make sure that we are getting that fact, keeping an open mind to what information we're getting, and then communicate back. Try to always avoid talking down to your employees. If you start talking down to them, then your employees can feel like you're acting superior to them. Just because you are the manager, just because you're the chef, doesn't mean you're above them, better than your employees. Again, if it's not for your employees, guess what? You don't have a business. So be conscientious about how you talk to the employees or how you communicate with the employees, so they don't feel that you are talking down to them. And again, if you are talking and communicating through an emotional standpoint as opposed to a factual standpoint, when you emotionally talk, it's really easy to accidentally talk down to somebody, even though you don't necessarily mean it. That's why if you can gather your thoughts and calm those emotions a little bit before you communicate back, you're going to have less instances of that talking down when it comes to your communication. Be straightforward in your feedback, because most employees value that direct communication. Some of them are not going to like to hear it, but again, how you put it together makes a huge difference when it comes to how you communicate. But be straightforward about, here is the concern. Here is what's been observed. This is this item that we need to work on to improve your performance. Be straightforward with people. Most people appreciate that straightforwardness. Be positive. You want to try to be positive about it, because you don't want your employees to feel like they're being punished, but use constructive feedback as a learning opportunity. I've always told, and I'll tell you all the same thing at the end of the 8 weeks. At the end of the 8 weeks, I have a class survey for this class, and I ask you to give me constructive feedback. What parts did you like? What parts didn't you like? How can I improve this class? I am primarily a lab-based professor. You are in the kitchen with me and we're cooking and we're doing all of this stuff. I teach some lecture classes, but they are not my bread and butter, so to speak. It's not the ones I do most of the time. So it's not, I don't want to say it's my strongest area. It's areas I know that there's things I can improve upon for the experience for you all. And so, I want to look at that end of the class survey as a learning opportunity for me on how I can improve myself as a professor. And on the flip side, if there are things that you're not doing as well or things that you can improve upon, when I'm talking to you, I want to give you constructive feedback and be like, here are the things that are going great. Here are the things that I think if we work on together, that you'll be able to, even do better than what you've done this time. It's about how you give that constructive feedback that can make a difference for the employee, whether they see it as you, being punished or you punishing them or you talking down to them, or the flip side of you wanting to help them improve themselves as professionals. And, be patient when it comes to your employees, because remember, in the end, this is a long-term thing. It's so you need let them understand that that this is long-term. I mean, if there's certain things that need to be, it's something that's really bad that needs to be corrected right now. Yes, those are, certain instances, but in a lot of times it can be things where, hey, it's going to take some time to get to this level. Make sure your employee knows that you're with them for the long haul and you're there to support them and be there for them and to help them reach their professional goals when it comes to that stuff. So, when you've got, and you're going to have to do it, you're going to be giving constructive feedback if you're in a management position. That's part of the gig when it comes to that. Whether you're the chef, whether you're the professor, whether you're the store manager, whatever that case may be, there will be times as a manager that you have to give constructive feedback to your employees and, use some of these guidelines to help you with that difficult conversation. Because for a lot of people, it is really difficult. It's easy for us to talk about the things you're doing great. It's tougher to have the conversation about things that could be improved upon sometimes, because nobody wants to hear what they're not doing well. But again, depending on how you set the framework up for it, people can take it as, here are things that you can do as a learning opportunity to improve yourself as a professional. It's all about mindset in a lot of cases. Okay. Internal versus external communication. So, you're going to have instances where you have internal communication, which are things that are going to your employees, to management, things along those lines. Ways that you can do internal communication include bulletin boards, inter-office memos, those things such as the pre-shift meetings, interdepartment communications. There's different ways that you can communicate written and verbally with your employees. And you want to make sure you're using multiple versions, because again, different people learn different ways. Some are written, some are auditory, some are, that textile that they like to be able to touch and hold on to things. So if you can incorporate different ways of communication, it's definitely going to go a long way for your employees to be grasping what you are trying to communicate. External communication, so communicating with people outside of the industry or outside of our business. There's different ways. You can see here in Exhibit 3.16 through print methods, letters, mail, coupons, press releases, billboards, posters, all these different things. Some of these, most of these actually are more of an advertising type of thing. You can communicate through television and radio, through PSAs, public service announcements, or commercials, whether they're radio or television commercials, direct speaking, in-person sales calls, conversations with customers, word of mouth communication, community service and other group, and telephone. And of course, we also have electronic means through email, text messages, social media, websites, e-coupons, different ways that we can communicate. That, of course, is getting into more of the marketing side, which we will talk about towards the end of our 8 weeks together. But, while it is marketing, it's also communication. We are communicating with our customers in different formats. And there's, as you can see, a lot of different ways that we can look at communicating with our customers and with the general public. So communication, just to wrap up, again, another important area as far as the manager is concerned, because you are going to be required to communicate effectively with your employees, with your vendors, with your customers, with the general public. And you need to make sure that you are fairly well versed in this area, especially going to be as a chef, because as the chef, you are part of the face of that restaurant, of that establishment. And a good restaurant is going to utilize you as a personality, so to speak, to help with the restaurant's image and such. And so you need to be familiar with how to communicate with people, whether you're communicating to your employees and your boss, or across the departments, or you're communicating with the public through verbal and written means. The communication is extremely important, and you need to make sure that it is something that you are working on. It's something that the more you do it, the more you practice it, the better you are going to become. So that, ladies and gentlemen, is the end of chapter 3.